Hello and welcome to this video. On our channel you can find a lot of videos about web development. What you can find so far is a beginner's guide, so a guide that helps you if you just started web development or if you never coded before. That's the purpose of this mini-series, because in this series we will take a look at the basics of web development. Specifically, we will take a look at front-end web development, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's start right now and have a look at the first steps in HTML together. So how do we start such a mini-series? How do we get the easiest entry into the complex area of web development? Well, I think a good starting point is the answer to this question. How does the web actually work? Because the starting point could be you or me. We are sitting there as users or as so-called clients, and we could enter a URL into our browser. Now, talking about browsers, the browser could be Chrome, could be Firefox, could be Edge, could be Safari, whatever you want. The important thing is that with entering this URL, we are sending a GET request. Well, why are we sending this? Obviously, because we want to display information in our browser. We want to display the web page, in this case apple.com, so we need information. Specifically, we are sending a HTTP request. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and this simply means that we want to fetch information to display it in the browser. Now the question is, what type of information are we requesting? Well, the browser could respect different types of information. For example, it could also request zip files or something like that. But let's assume for the moment that the browser requests information in the HTML format, so HTML code. Now, why are we assuming that? Well, because every web page is based on HTML. So without HTML code, you can't display your web page. And that's the reason why we request HTML code from the server. Now, from which server? Well, we enter this URL, and in this URL, we enter the domain apple.com. And because of that, we're requesting information, HTML code, from the Apple server. Now, let's assume another thing. Let's assume that this request was successful. What happens then is that we would get a response from the server. And what would that response look like? Well, we requested HTML. So because of that, we would get HTML code back from the server. And this HTML code is really important because this HTML code includes the content and the structure of our web page. And that's why we need HTML code for each web page that we have, because without content and structure, well, there is nothing to display. Now, is there anything more that we could get back as a response from the server? And just to be precise, I'm referring to additional information that is part of that HTML file, because we only get back one HTML file from the server. So is there anything more that we could get back? Well, the answer is yes, we can. Another thing we could get back is CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And CSS is required to add some styling to our web page. So for example, to change the colors of specific areas of that web page to make it look more beautiful or better. Now, do we need CSS? No, we don't need CSS at all because, as I said, HTML, by the way, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. I didn't mention it before, so now we know that. So HTML is the content and the structure. And if we have the content and the core structure, then the web page would be totally fine, but ugly. And we don't want ugly pages. We want our web pages to look good, and therefore we need CSS. We'll talk about CSS in detail throughout this mini-series. Now, is there more to come? It is. We could also get JavaScript. Now, what's that now? Well, JavaScript is basically responsible to add logic to our web page. What do I mean by logic? Well, logic is necessary if we have something where a condition is required. So let's assume if we enter an email into a specific field, we want to display valid or invalid. In this case, we need a conditional function, and this is based on JavaScript. Now let's summarize that. The response from the server is always HTML. if it works, of course, so if the request was successful. In this HTML code, we get the basic structure and the content of the web page. An optional additional response could be CSS to add some styling and JavaScript to add some logic to our web page. Now, as soon as we got this responses or this response, we can display the web page in our browser. And that's actually how the web generally works. Of course, there is a lot more, because as I said in the beginning of this video, in this series we will take a look at front-end web development. This means everything that runs in the browser. Now, as you can imagine, there is more. Let's assume you are on apple.com and you want to create a user account. By that, Apple needs to save your email and the corresponding password. And this shouldn't be saved in the browser, of course. This should be saved on the server. And for that purpose, you need a backend, so backend web development for databases, for example. This is something we will not cover throughout this mini-series. However, Max created an awesome video where he gives you a great overview of web development in general. So he shows you front-end web development, back-end web development, frameworks, and a lot more. So definitely check out this video if you want to find out more about that. Now, back to front-end web development though, because we saw that now in theory, and this is nice, but can we also see that if we really type apple.com into our browser? Well, let's find that out right now. So here I am in Chrome right now. And I'm in Chrome because, well, I said that you can use any browser you want a few minutes ago. That's totally correct. But for the purpose of this mini-series, I highly recommend to use Chrome. Because Chrome comes with an integrated tool actually, or toolset, the Chrome Developer Tools. And with these tools, we can take a look at the details behind the web page actually, so at parts of the code, for example. And this is really important if we want to understand how the web works in general, and also when we want to create our own web page. Therefore, I recommend using Chrome, and I will use Chrome right here. So it would be awesome if you could do the same, because then it's easy to follow this video. However, I'm in Chrome right now, as I said, and I talked about these developer tools. Where can we find these developer tools actually? Well, the developer tools can be found either here, if you click onto these three dots up here, and now go to more tools and the developer tools. Or, so I'm on the Mac right here, so on the Mac you can type Command, Option, so Alt and I, to open the developer tools. That's what they look like. If you're using a Windows machine, you can simply press F12 to access the developer tools with this shortcut. However, now we see these developer tools. Let me maybe make them a little bit bigger for you. And up here we see different tabs actually. Now I'm in the network tab already, and that's also the tab you should go to. As soon as we did that, we can now enter apple.com, and then let's see what happens right here in this network tab. So now apple.com finished loading, and as you can see in our network tab, a lot of information was loaded into the browser. Chronologically, by the way. So you see the chronological loading order here in this network tab. Now let's have a look at what we got right here. What you can see right here are some images, for example. Here we can see JS, that stands for JavaScript. You remember, that was that part of the response that was responsible for the logic on our web page. We can also see CSS, so cascading style sheets. That's the part that makes our web page look more beautiful. Also something we will talk about later throughout this mini-series. But if we scroll to the beginning, we can see this, apple.com. By the way, this status 200 simply means, well, as you can see right here, the request was okay, so a response was delivered actually. Now, what happens if we click onto apple.com? Let's do that now. And increase the size a little bit maybe, oops, like that. Well, as you can see here in this headers tab, we have the request URL, so we wanted to go to apple.com. You can see the request method. You remember on the slide, we talked about that get request that we sent. We can see the status code 200. We talked about that, it's okay. And we can also get some other information like the response headers. We will not talk about that right now. That's something we will cover later. The important thing right now is that our request was successful and that we received an HTML file. How do I know that this is HTML? Well, if we look at preview right here, Then you can see that we have this doc type HTML thing, and then we have HTML written right here. So that's pure HTML code you will see right here, and which we received from apple.com based on our request that we sent. Now, let's have a quick look at this code without going into the details. Because you can see HTML right here. If we scroll to the right, you can see this bigger than sign. So we see that this kind of wraps HTML. Then we see head, also with the smaller than and bigger than signs. Then we have some metadata right here. Also something we will not talk about now in detail, just for you to see that there is really a lot of code in here. Interesting part now is that head is again mentioned right there. You remember we had head up here, but without the slash, just head. And down there, we have head now again with the smaller and bigger sign, but also with a slash. That's interesting. Let's keep that in mind. After head, we got the body. There is some class attached to it. We can ignore it for the moment. But again, body is kind of opened apparently. Then we have a lot of information in here. So let's scroll to the end right now of this HTML code. So here I am now in the last lines. And as you can see, body is now mentioned again, now with that slash. And the same thing is true for HTML. You remember that was written at the beginning when the whole HTML code started actually. Now, apparently, this HTML code can somehow be interpreted by the browser and display the page. As I said before, to display the page the way it is right here, it needs a lot more like CSS and JavaScript. But generally, HTML is a code that can be interpreted by the browser. Now, this is a really big file and we can't dive into all the details. But why can't we just create an HTML file on our own and then add some content to our web page? Is that possible? And the answer is yes. The only thing we need to write basic HTML code is a text editor. And as we got a text editor on our computer, why don't we just create an index.html file and see how we can write code and how it is displayed in the browser. Let's do this right now. As I said before, I'm working on a MacBook right here, and therefore I opened an empty file in TextEdit. If you work on a Windows machine, you can do the same thing by only using Notepad. Now, for Notepad, you don't have to adjust anything. If you're using TextEdit on the MacBook, you need to make sure that this is displayed as plain text, not as rich text, because rich text will add some additional information to the file, and because of that, it will be displayed wrong, or it can be displayed wrong in the browser later. Therefore, make sure that this is plain text. You can quickly check that by going to Format up here, and now see that this is not rich text. So if you click on to make rich text, this is rich text, this is wrong. So go back to Format and change it to make plain text. This is correct. Now we have the text editor right here, and we will create this HTML file. But before we do that, let's add some content. The content could be, hello, I am a web page. Really creative. Now let's save this to create an HTML file. So right here, I selected a folder. You can leave the plain text encoding to Unicode UTF-8, that's correct. The important thing is that you don't save this file as text, but as index.html, like that. Now we save that. And if we now navigate to the folder where you saved the file to, in my case, this is right here. This is the index.html file that we created. Then, well, how can we now display it in the browser? Actually, there are two options. The first option, and this is the option you should always use if you create your own web page, is using a development server. Because you remember back the slide we had, that actually we enter a URL into the browser, then we send a request to a server, and then get a response. Now, the problem is that this file is located on our computer, and we can't send a request to our own computer. With a development server, we can do that. We will not talk about the details how to set up a development server right now, because as I said before, we have two options. We have this development server, and we can simply open that file with a double click. Then the file will be open in the browser, and then we can also display our web page. The important thing though, as I said before, is that this approach should not be used if you really want to create your own web page, because there might be certain features of your page which are not working correctly if you just open the HTML file via double click in the browser. So to summarize that, the option you should follow normally when you create your own web pages is the development server. In our case right here, as we just apply some basic HTML right now, we can simply double click onto the HTML file to see what happens. Just keep that in mind. However, as I said, we can simply double click right now, like this. And now we see that a new tab opens, and in this tab, we can now see, hello, I am a web page. Now, what does this mean? Well, this basically means that the browser was able to interpret the HTML file we created. That's quite awesome, but not really impressive probably. But it's a starting point. Let's go back to our text editor now and see what else we can add right here. Because right here we have, hello, I'm a web page. Now, what if I add something like, and this is line 2, maybe, like that. And let's say this should be a paragraph because it's line 2. Let's save that. Always important, save any changes, otherwise it can't be displayed in the browser. Now let's switch back to the browser and press reload right here. Well, now you see that, and this is line 2, is displayed, but it's displayed in the same line as hello, I'm a web page. And that's not the way it should be, right? Because obviously HTML and the browser cannot understand the paragraph we typed in the text editor. So we need to add something. And this something is a tag. You remember these tags we had at apple.com, this HTML and body tags, for example. Let's go back to the text editor and add such a tag. Let's add a tag. And a potential tag, or a good tag right here, could be P for paragraph. Of course, I'm not randomly choosing the paragraph right here. There are specific given tags available in HTML which can be interpreted by the browser. We'll have a look at these tags that are available in the next videos of this series. The important thing for now is that we use the paragraph because it's an available tag and it's a tag that makes sense right here in this example. So let's add the paragraph right now. So let's add the smaller sign, P, and the larger sign. Then after our content, that's the content, we add another smaller sign. Now a slash, P, and the larger than symbol. Now what did we create right here? We created an element right here. So this is an element, and this element has an opening tag right here, and a closing tag right there, and the content, and the content that should be displayed, like that. Now let's save this and see if we now created a paragraph. Let's reload the browser right here. And indeed, we did. So that's interesting, right? HTML and the browser understand this p tag as a paragraph. And by that, we now created that second text as a new line. So here you can already see that tags are really important in HTML. Because as I said before, HTML is responsible for the content and the general structure of the web page. And how should the browser know that it should make a paragraph right here? And because of that, it's really important that we always add tags to our content in an HTML file. And this also means that hello, I'm a web page right here, although displayed correctly, is not best practice code. Because if we go back to the text editor, we can see that we only have the text right here, but no opening and closing tag. Therefore, we should change that. And we could easily change it by adding also a paragraph to it. Like this and like that maybe. Let's save this. And if we go back right now and reload the page, we can see nothing changed, but we created the code in a best practice manner. So keep that in mind. Always use tags when you create content in your HTML file. Another thing we saw is that HTML actually forgives a lot of mistakes. Because if you think back about the HTML file we saw on apple.com, we saw that this file included things like doc type on top, and we had this HTML, this head, and these body tags. Now all these tags are not part of our HTML file right here, and the browser still could interpret it. Nevertheless, it's always important to write best practice code, as said before, because otherwise your code is not really efficient or might be slow, and additionally, it's hard to read and understand by other people. Let's maybe have a look at one additional tag. So for the purpose, let's go back to the text editor. Let's maybe add something like I am the header, something like this. Now, as you can imagine right here, if I save this and go back, the header is added up there. That's nice. Let's go back again. Now, what if I add another tag, an h1 tag maybe, and close it right here and save it? Let's see what happens now. If I go back right here and reload the page, well, then we can see that we applied some styling to our header. How can that be? Didn't I tell you before that for styling purposes we use CSS? That's totally true. And that's also important to keep in mind, because although h1 adds some styling right here, this styling could be easily changed by CSS. So we could, for example, easily change, and this is line 2, to the same format like this header up here. That's easy to do, and because of that, always keep in mind that styling is related to CSS. Additionally, this h1 styling right here is interpreted by the browser. Therefore, this might look different if you don't use Chrome, but use Firefox, for example. Therefore, that's not the way to style your content. But why do we have these tags then? Well, imagine a newspaper. In a newspaper, you also have the header section, and then you have a content section. And that's actually the logic that you can follow right here. With this h1 tag, you simply make it easy to identify which part should be the header in your HTML document. We will talk about more tags, of course, throughout the next videos. But that's actually the main thing you should keep in mind regarding the opening and closing tags. It's always important to use these tags to add structure to your HTML file. You can also think about a blind person right here, because this person obviously cannot see a web page, so the person might use a screen reader. And this screen reader needs information about the content of the page. So we need clear tags, and by that, elements with a clear meaning to make sure that the page can be interpreted correctly. And with that, we are now actually done with the first part of this mini-series. We now had a basic look at how the web in general works. We saw that we create GET requests by entering a URL into the browser. We also saw that we get responses, which always should include HTML and optionally CSS and JavaScript. We saw how this works in the Chrome developer tools on apple.com, and we created our own index.html file with some basic content, which we can now display in the browser. So that's a really huge step for the beginning actually. But in the next video, we will change the perspective, because right now we had a look at how the web works, but actually we are web developers. We want to know how web developers work. So let's have a look at that in the next video then. Hope to see you there. Bye.